Hey all, welcome to Eric Rates Games, the channel that provides the most in-depth game reviews. There are timestamps in the video below, so please feel free to jump around as needed. Today we'll be taking a look at Returnal on the PS5, so without further delay, let's jump right in. Returnal is a roguelike third-person bullet hell shooter developed by Finnish gaming studio Housemarque and published by Sony. It was originally released as a PS5 exclusive, and while delivering respectable early sales of 560,000, paled in comparison to hits like Elden Ring, which sold 5.4 million PlayStation copies in the same time frame. Returnal has received predominantly positive reviews, typically scoring either 8 or 9 out of 10. With smooth gameplay, challenging combat, a unique format, and almost full parity co-op, it certainly excelled in some areas. However, roguelike games aren't for everyone, and there were a couple areas where it missed the mark. In Returnal, you are Brienne of Tart, or Celine Vassos, an astronaut who has crash-landed on the planet Atropos. The circumstances surrounding the crash and potential rescue are shrouded in a mystery that must be solved while surviving an extremely hostile and evolving environment. This entails grabbing your favorite space gun, blowing up some creepy aliens, and collecting strengthening items while navigating a slew of unique and challenging otherworldly biomes. Survival is the name of the game, as death transports you right back to the start, in a vicious time loop that'll have you saying, "Wait, really? Like, the start of the game?" As mentioned, the story of Returnal focuses on Celine Vassos, who is an astronaut investigating a mysterious white signal before a bright flash strikes and damages her ship, forcing her to crash land. Celine tries to make contact with Astra, presumably the organization she represents, before beginning her own investigation. Before long, Celine stumbles across a dead scout and is shocked to discover that the scout appears to be her. The irregularities are just getting started, as she soon uncovers a recording of her own voice warning that she is trapped on this planet in an infinite time loop. Between death and rebirth, images, perhaps forgotten memories, flash before her eyes. All of these events create the backdrop of a psychological thriller the game targets, and I have to admit, it's pretty well done. The events are interesting and compel you to figure out just what the heck is going on. The table is set for a fascinating story to unfold. Additional logs are recovered as the story progresses, offering extra snippets of information. Other puzzling clues are revealed on stone pillars that require xenoglyph ciphers to translate. I will say that after finding the first message largely nonsensical, I was less motivated to unlock and read others. This was true of the audio logs as well. There were too many that were either misleading or repetitive, and the further I progressed, the less interested I was in recovering them. The last key plot driver is Celine's house, curiously sitting abandoned in a randomly generated room in the game's first biome. Once unlocked, rooms trigger a sequence of cutscenes that provide details about Celine's past. The house can be visited in a handful of separate cycles, unlocking additional plot points and items. Once the cutscenes of the house are exhausted, less informative xenoglyph pillars and audio logs further the plot until the game ends. To summarize, I think that even though the story starts strong, building intrigue, it suffers from trying to drag the story through the entire game. While I won't spoil the final reveal, I can't say that I was personally impressed. For starters, I was outright confused as to who I was supposed to be, and if I can't identify myself with certainty during the game's final cutscene, then the story wasn't written clearly enough. To fully understand everything, the player is expected to notice subtle callbacks from singular scenes, and when mixed in with all the filler, it's an unrealistic expectation. I also expected the biome bosses to represent symbolic plot points, but that didn't seem to be the case. Trying to derive specific meaning from any of them seems highly speculative at best. As the saying goes, it's not how you start, it's how you finish. And for that reason, the story in Returnal was average at best. The game flow in Returnal is unique to say the least. Biomes must be cleared by progressing through procedurally generated rooms while finding strength-bolstering artifacts, weapons, and items. Each biome is complete with its own boss that must be defeated prior to gaining access to the next biome. Defeating a biome typically results in permanent equipment upgrades that grant access to additional rooms and areas during subsequent cycles. This is critical to progressing, as generally speaking, you'll need all the help you can get. An additional benefit to beating a biome is that the biome boss can be skipped in a future playthrough. In fact, certain equipment enables shortcuts to later biomes, if players dare. The game stays mostly true to its roguelike roots, the exception being one hard checkpoint after clearing the third biome. So you're basically 0% through the game, 50% through the game, or 100% through the game, presuming no mid-cycle pauses. While this unique format, coupled with the intentionally challenging enemies and game design, may lead to frustration, I found it interesting, and with the stakes raised, took the mentality of game on. The combat system in Returnal is really good. In particular, I enjoyed the dash function, which allows teleportation with partial invulnerability. These invulnerability, or iframes, create a timing element to combat, resulting in a highly variable skill cap. The dash and its iframes are not only crucial to evading enemy attacks, but also play a critical role in traversing hostile terrain. This includes a wide variety of laser-emitting devices and surfaces like lava or water that are inaccessible until unlocking permanent equipment. When using your dashes perfectly, you will feel almost invincible, and when executing them poorly, you'll die quickly. Pro tip: dashing before impact during long falls prevents Selene from staggering upon landing. Apart from dash timing, players must also move in a strategic fashion to avoid a deluge of potential enemy attack patterns. Equipment like the Ikarian grapnel further increase mobility and provide an additional way to leverage motion advantageously. Other defensive strategies include using terrain to reduce attackable surface area, and the world is designed in a way that supports this. On the offensive side of the equation, aim is the most critical aspect. This is especially the case for enemies that have exploitable weak spots. Aiming while moving is common, meaning you'll often forgo looking down the sights. Another mechanic that packs a punch is the alt-fire function. This special attack comes in a variety of forms and has a cooldown between uses. Strategically firing this special attack frequently will significantly increase your damage output. The second mechanic is adrenaline. Adrenaline starts at 0, and for every 3 enemy kills without taking damage, is increased 1 level to a maximum of 5. High adrenaline increases passive damage output from your shoulder-mounted gun. There are also special benefits for each level, which include: Level 1, the overload reload zone is bigger. Level 2, scans travel further. Level 3, melee cooldown is decreased. Level 4, weapon proficiency improves 50% faster. Level 5, gain plus 50% more Obelites. While the first 2 benefits are modest, Level 3 will greatly help melee builds, and Level 4 and 5 simply speed up leveling. As a result, you'll want to spend as much time as possible at high adrenaline. This, however, is far easier said than done. One last feature I'll mention is Obelite collection. Obelites burst from defeated enemies in quantities loosely tied to their toughness. The closer an enemy is when dying, the more Obelites you'll collect. So while conventional wisdom might suggest killing enemies from a safe distance, this Obelite collection feature will punish that style. The other critical choice is what weapon to use. It is important to choose a weapon that synergizes with your playstyle. The weapon classes include the Modified Sidearm. This is the starting weapon, and with its base kit, does low damage with moderate range and a small clip. While some claim it gets good access to traits, most agree that it's best to ditch it at the first opportunity. The Blade. This is one of the first permanent upgrades you unlock near the end of the first biome. The blade is a powerful weapon, often one-shotting smaller enemies. A benefit to using the blade early is that you'll collect full Obelites upon killing an enemy. There are also artifacts that increase the blade power for melee-centric builds. Also important is that certain enemies possess a shield that makes them invulnerable to all weapons until the shield is broken by the blade. Next on the list is the Tetriomatic Carbine. This is the first new weapon you unlock. It has good range, good damage, and a reasonably sized clip. It's your solid, all-around weapon and is considered decent at all points of the game. I personally enjoyed the leeching rounds and rising pitch traits that drained health and significantly increased damage output. After that is the Spit Maw Blaster. This is the second weapon you unlock and it packs a serious punch. Unfortunately, this shotgun-style weapon requires you to be up close to do big damage. As the game progresses and enemies are able to do more damage from further away, the blaster falls off. General consensus is that the narrow maw trait is best for this weapon to help counteract the limited range. After the blaster comes the Hollow Seeker. The Hollow Seeker is another weapon you unlock relatively early with serious staying power. Similar to the carbine, it has great range and by far the largest magazine size. While starting with low initial damage and projectile speed, the traits it unlocks, like Portal Beam, scale nicely with the big clip size and make it a late game monster. Next is the Thermogenetic Launcher. The launcher is the first mid-game unlock and is a rocket launcher type weapon with 3 default rounds that fire and move slower than you'd expect. The rockets do reasonable damage, splash, and stagger, but not enough to offset the early weaknesses. The launcher has one particular trait, Full Auto, that flips the script on the fire rate and turns it from being underpowered to quite good. After that is the Rockgland Lobber. The Rockgland Lobber is a mid-game unlock and while not for everyone, was one of my personal favorites. It starts with 1 round in its magazine and has an arcing motion that must be charged to travel max distance. But man, does it hit like a truck. Not only does it deal big initial damage, but it poisons enemies, creating a damage over time effect. This can be useful for enemies with big health pools, where a hit and hide strategy can be employed. Lastly, the limited magazine can be offset with well-timed overloads, and when paired with an artifact that gives you benefits per successful overload, can synergize nicely. After that comes the Electropylon Driver. The Electropylon Driver sort of straddles the mid and late game and is a pretty unique weapon. It does good damage and most importantly creates a web of lasers that do slow and constant damage over time. Webs can be built on an enemy to do damage or can be used defensively to lure enemies into them, making the Pylon Driver quite versatile. The first of the endgame weapons is the Dreadbound. This is perhaps the most unintuitive weapon in the game. It starts with only 3 rounds, but bullets return back once hitting a target. Thus, if you can stay close to enemies and hit them, your first round will return before the third shoots, allowing infinite fire. These rounds do a lot of damage per hit, and thus, with optimal play, the Dreadbound has insanely high DPS. Interestingly, the Dreadbound is the only weapon that doesn't get the reload mechanic, and players must wait for a round to return before firing the next. This means missing an enemy will see the projectile soar off into the distance and take far longer to return. Thus, the Dreadbound is a weapon for skilled players who are accurate and don't mind getting up close and personal. Next is the Pyroshell Caster. This is a late game weapon that acts like a grenade launcher, dealing big damage and splashing significantly to nearby targets. The projectiles shoot in an arc most similar to the Lobber, but the caster has many more default rounds. One personal issue I had is the delay before the rounds explode. Typically you rely on stunning enemies when you shoot them, and by having a delay, enemies can counterattack before being interrupted. The last weapon of the game is the Coil Spine Shredder. It can only be found in a secret area after unlocking the last upgrade. Like the Lobber, it starts with only 1 round and can be charged to pierce and ricochet off terrain. While initially underwhelming due to low fire rate, if fully upgraded and with certain buffs, this weapon can actually 5-shot the last boss. Weapon tier lists for Returnal are an absolute cluster. This kind of makes sense, as testing not only involves each weapon, but every locked and randomly assigned trait. Leveling up traits is a long process, and to truly test every one would require an absurd amount of time played, even for someone like me. At the end of the day, the fact that there isn't universal consensus may be a good thing, and speaks to the weapons being more balanced than most people think. So just focus on finding one that fits your personal playstyle, and you should do just fine. The last aspect of combat are the consumable items. These can be offensive and straightforward like the Spike Surge, defensive like the Shield Vial, provide buffs like the Apex Sphere, or have supplementary effects like transporting you to a treasure room. While some items definitely seem better than others, most have a situational application and add a little extra spice to combat. To summarize, I'd say this game did a great job in incorporating interesting and unique features. Using dash, strategic movement, terrain, weak spots, alt fires, and maintaining high adrenaline all provide depth and a widely variable skill cap. The guns and consumable items are both unique and plentiful, and help add layers of complexity that keeps combat fresh for many playthroughs. Leveling in Returnal is unique in that a vast majority of the strength gained in a given cycle is immediately lost upon death. This includes things like stat augments, artifacts, parasites, proficiency, consumables, and Obelites, aka money. There are, however, a handful of permanent benefits that I'll cover first. The most straightforward perk is that defeating any biome boss in a given cycle enables bypassing that boss in the future. Next are unlockable equipment upgrades that generally grant the ability to access new areas or empower your combat. While there are only 8 total upgrades, including 2 reserved for increasing the number of max consumables, getting access to new areas typically results in extra items or artifacts that can be the difference between surviving the next room or starting a brand new cycle. Last of the permanent upgrades are weapon traits. When picking up a weapon, it is randomly assigned a series of traits. The traits are permanently unlocked by killing enemies with the weapon. Each weapon has unique traits that can be leveled multiple times. Due to the time-consuming nature, it is generally wise to only unlock traits for weapons you enjoy. Also note that some traits are better than others, like the Portal Beam for the Hollow Seeker or Full Auto for the Rocket Launcher. You'll have to decide if you want to prioritize unlocking more traits for future runs, or pick weapons with fully unlocked traits to go all in on your current playthrough. Note that until reaching the max proficiency of a given act, you'll likely be switching weapons somewhat frequently. The last permanent resource in Returnal is Ether. This useful substance can be used in a variety of ways, including cleansing malignant chests or items, creating a copied version of yourself at a reconstructor, scavenging an item from an astronaut corpse, unlocking items or artifacts at Donos, being exchanged for Obelites at a criminal rate at the Obelite repository, or synergizing with artifacts that give bonuses per ether carried. While most will initially use ether to cleanse, as you complete more cycles you might find the other applications preferable. I tend to save ether for either unlocking new artifacts at Donos, exchanging for Obelites, cleansing a healing item in a dire situation, or simply keeping it around to synergize with artifacts. Note that the max ether is 30 and thus should be used upon reaching that total. Before getting into the temporary items, let me first outline some devices. First are fabricators. These devices hold artifacts or stat augmentations typically available for purchase, although sometimes for free. The next device worth noting is the reconstructor. This will create a copy of you that will resurrect at the site upon death in exchange for ether. While it sounds like a good deal, one drawback is that dying at a boss after using consumables respawns you without them. Facing that same boss itemless is generally a hopeless prospect. For that reason, the reconstructor is better leveraged as a pre-boss insurance policy that can be used to play more recklessly while preserving items pre-boss fight. Other helpful devices are reclaimers. Reclaimers are stone-looking beds that either glow red or green. The green, inert reclaimers are great, and simply grant additional max integrity and health regen. The red beds are double-edged and offer an item in exchange for potential health. While not always the case, red beds will typically drain at least some life, especially if you have a lot of it, and can provide useful artifacts or less useful consumables. You'll have to assess the risk given your unique circumstance. Another useful device is the Parasite Harvester. This can be used to randomly remove a parasite in exchange for Obelites, and is great for either A, getting rid of a parasite that sounded good at the time but is now regrettable, or B, converting a parasite that is kind of meh into useful Obelites. A fourth device is the Damaged Fabricator. This device offers players a random consumable or artifact for the reasonable price of 75 Obelites. However, after each use, the cost increases and becomes a greater gamble. For those not saving for a known item, it's generally worthwhile for the first roll, at least. Next on the list is the Data Cube Processor. One data cube can be carried at a time, and dropping these off at the Data Cube Processor unlocks an item or artifact for future runs. Moving on to the temporary upgrades, these are the items and or stats needed to boost strength and prepare for the biome bosses. Weapon Proficiency is the first stat to cover and is primarily increased by killing enemies. This stat dictates the level of new weapons. Proficiency ranges from 0 to 15 in Act 1 and from 15 to 30 in Act 2. Weapons will either match your current proficiency level or can spawn up to 3 levels higher. Higher level weapons have additional stat points in damage and other class-specific auxiliary stats. Unsurprisingly, they make killing enemies a lot easier and explain why guns are periodically exchanged throughout a given cycle. The next important category are artifacts. These range from phenomenal effects, such as instant resurrection upon death, to those that fall into the meh category. Some are particularly good if found early, like the Resin Enhancer that only requires 2 resin to increase health instead of 3, and some, like the Murmuring Cocoon, go well with thematic builds like those that focus on collecting parasites. You can carry up to 15 artifacts and can manually destroy any to make room for others. The next important category are stat augmentations. These simply boost your base level stats and come in the following categories. Weapon damage, how much damage you do. Protection, your resistance to enemy damage. Proficiency rate, how quickly you can acquire more powerful weapons. Repair efficiency, how much health items heal you. Alt-fire cooldown, how long alt-fire takes to recharge. And max integrity, how much total health you have. As far as I can tell, these stats can be increased indefinitely, although not surprisingly, aren't cheap. In terms of what to prioritize, since dying has dire consequences, I'd say max integrity and protection should be on the top of the list. After that, repair efficiency and weapon damage make up the second tier, with alt cooldown and proficiency being least important. Consumables, like most things in the game, vary in number and value. These range from the critical large Silphium vials that heal the majority of even augmented health bars, to often useless shocking springs that do AoE damage where you jump, which, okay, but aren't I usually jumping away from enemies? You start with only 1 consumable slot, eventually reaching a total of 3. Note that multiple versions of the same item fit in a singular slot and should be stockpiled if possible. Next is Resin. Resin is one of 2 green Silphium items. Its function is to fill 1 of 3 slots that upon completion add an incremental amount of integrity to Selene's suit. The other Silphium item is Health Regeneration. It comes in minor, moderate, and the ever-glorious large size. Note that regular Silphium turns into resin if you're already at full health, rewarding damage-free play. Parasites are the next critical non-permanent resource. They come with both a positive and negative effect and must be carefully considered based on your given situation and playstyle. For example, if you're someone who likes using melee attacks, then you want to avoid a parasite that reduces melee damage by 50%, whereas if you hardly ever melee, then it's probably worth picking up. If you're on the fence about a parasite, I'd recommend picking it up. This is because A, some artifacts give you bonuses based on how many parasites you're carrying. B, certain items let you recycle a given parasite. C, you'll occasionally come across parasite harvesters that let you exchange a random parasite for Obelites an unlimited number of times. And D, they make your suit look kinda cool. Atropian keys are another key item. They unlock rooms or chests that often contain an artifact or stat enhancer. While this isn't always the case, there will always be something of value in a locked room, and despite cycles being randomly generated, you will almost always find far fewer keys than places to use them. Another important Returnal resource are Obelites. These burst from slain enemies, can be found in small or large chunk form, and when playing online can be exchanged at Obelite repositories for ether and vice versa. Obelites are used for purchasing artifacts and stat augmentations from fabricators. Similar to keys, the amount of Obelites pales in comparison to the purchasable items, and thus are highly precious resources. The last resource to cover is Weapon Caliber, which increases weapon proficiency. Like Silphium, Caliber comes in 3 sizes that directly increase your proficiency a commensurate amount. Make sure to collect as many possible to help scale your weapon as the cycle progresses. The final element of leveling that needs to be covered are Maligancies. Certain items in the game, such as chests, chunks of Obelites, or Silphium, can be colored purple, meaning that they are infected with a malignancy. Malignancies come in various severities that affect the probability of getting a malfunction when interacting with the infected item. Selene can only tolerate 2 malfunctions at a time, and upon receiving a third, will trigger a critical malfunction. Critical malfunctions will destroy either artifacts, keys, or 1 max resin slot. A destroyed artifact is the worst and most common result of critical malfunction, and thus should be avoided at all costs. Apart from the max number of malfunctions, each malfunction is assigned both a consequence and a required condition for removal. Both the consequences and conditions vary widely in severity. For instance, a malfunction might say Alt Fire cooldown increased 5 seconds, cleanse by opening a chest. These are both mild. It may also have your maximum integrity with the requirement of using an Atropian key. This is both a serious consequence and something that requires both finding a key and a place to use it, and thus can take much longer to resolve. Certain parasites will also increase the frequency of encountering malignant items or increase the difficulty of their removal conditions when attached. On the flip side, certain artifacts will increase max HP, give extra damage, or recover health when gaining a malfunction, and thus certain builds can be malfunction-centric. Players must decide whether harvesting the malignant items is worth the risk on a case-by-case basis. 2 general rules of thumb are, number 1, take a bit more risk at the start of your cycle because dying early in a run is better than dying later. Number 2, risking malfunctions on tangible rewards like large Obelite chunks is smarter than risking them on unknown rewards such as unopened chests. The menus in Returnal are excellent. They are streamlined, thematic, organized, easy to read, and possess just about every useful data point. The first set of menus are accessed from hitting the touchpad and are broken into 4 windows. First is the map. The map is quite useful as it can be zoomed in and out and has a large number of unique markers showing doors, devices, fabricators, chests, items, transporters, glyphs, weapons, and much more. There is also a mini-map set in the bottom right-hand corner that saves the trouble of opening to the main map in most cases. Also nice is that the icons vary between green pluses, teardrops, upside-down triangles, and more that denote more specific item classes. The map can be used to track down almost all items so long as the required equipment is accessible. Pro tip: items are hidden inside destructible terrain that must be destroyed before showing on the map. Pro tip 2: treasure rooms do not show on the map and must be discovered. Another nice feature of the map is that it will change the icon based on whether it is locked or unlocked. Doors that are locked will have 2 borders instead of 1, and chests will have a middle circle filled in instead of empty. One big miss on the map is that the icons don't distinguish between malignant and non-malignant items. This can lead to leaving behind a given item only to forget and circle back to it. I'm not sure why they didn't add some type of purple border to the icons that were malignant, as it would have been very useful. The status menu shows Obelites, keys, ether, integrity, proficiency, adrenaline, malfunctions, parasites, stats, and permanent upgrades. These are all laid out nicely in a futuristic interface meant to represent your suit's computer. Large type, logical spacing, and additional details add to the menu's crispness. The third tab is the equipment menu. This has your consumables, current weapon, including all traits, artifacts, and progress towards the locked data cube items. Similar to the status menu, additional detail is revealed in the corresponding box when hovering over given equipment. Lastly is the Databank, which has detailed info on just about everything. Examples include hostiles, items, weapons, artifacts, audio logs, and more. The secondary menu is opened with the Options button and will be used predominantly to suspend a cycle or quit the game. It also grants access to a set of tutorials and settings. Most interesting under settings are the ability to map your controls, adjust a feature called Aim Assist, or change how sprint is activated and deactivated. Like most games, the left joystick dictates movement while the right joystick regulates vision. L3 triggers Celine to sprint until she stops, while R3 sends a pulse throughout the room to identify potential enemies and doors. The touchpad opens the suit computer, or in-game menu, while the Options button opens the Settings menu. For the D-pad, up D-pad enters photo mode, and left and right D-pad toggle between consumables. Down D-pad doesn't seem to have a clear function outside of navigating menus. R2 fires your weapon, and while half pressed, L2 looks down the sights. Note that the game adds tension to the L2 trigger, requiring additional pressure to fully press down L2. This is helpful as fully pressing L2 makes R2 fire the Alt weapon instead of regular bullets. Kind of curiously, the R1 trigger does nothing at all. Why they didn't just have L2 always look down the sights and have R1 be the alternate fire and R2 be regular fire is odd to me. It seems like a much more logical approach than having a trigger that has to be half pressed or full pressed based on the desired action. Perhaps related, R1 seems like the only button you can't manually map under control settings. Triangle is used to pick up items, interact with devices, and lock onto grapnel targets. Circle is reserved for the all-important dash, X is set to jump, and square reserved for the melee or blade attack. Overall, the controls are pretty sensible, with the exception of the dual function L2 and oddly unused R1 triggers. Another acclaimed element of Returnal is the audio. The quaint and eerie scores are perhaps the most important element to reinforcing the sci-fi feel. The voice acting focuses predominantly on Celine, but is well done, if sometimes repetitive. The sound effects are also good, with each gun using a distinct firing sound and recognizable noises tied to various items and equipment. Celine's own vocals are pronounced, perhaps even overly so on occasion. Overall, the audio in the game feels professional, thematic, and is a boon to the otherworldly ambiance the game successfully achieves. The visual effects in Returnal are also impressive. Celine and enemies move at a high pace that matches both the sci-fi futuristic feel and increases gameplay difficulty. The enemy attacks are animated in the bullet hell style, where players dodge endless waves of colored projectiles. So while enemy attacks can look a bit odd to the uninitiated, they are animated skillfully for the genre. The dash effects, relative mix of patternistic bubbles, bullets, straight lasers, and melee attacks are all visually impressive and add to the game's intense and entertaining combat. The unique firing patterns of Celine's weapons are also eye-catching. Add to this the alt-fire options, one of which will have you feeling like Emperor Palpatine, and you won't want to blink. For most of the game, you'll find yourself in motion, and you won't be disappointed, as this game looks great doing it. In addition to the visually stimulating combat, the art also delivers. Each biome is diverse while preserving an extraterrestrial vibe. From lush jungles to barren deserts, snow-covered peaks, and more, the biomes are all distinct and beautiful in their own way. Other static elements like the alien devices, equipment, and parasites all look the part and are well animated. The 20th century house and cutscenes take full advantage of the PS5's increased specs and deliver near movie-like quality. In summation, whether you're flying through groups of enemies or taking in the view from a mountain peak, the game is going to look and sound impressive. The game length and replay value of Returnal are a bit questionable. Depending on how you count it, there are either 5 or 6 unique biomes, which felt like the bare minimum to constitute a whole game. Recall there is one hard checkpoint in the game. While I have no doubt that each biome took a considerable amount of effort to design, I can't help but feel like an additional hard checkpoint with 2 additional biomes would have really added some depth to the game and made it sit in your belly like a well-made chicken sub instead of a side Caesar salad. Add 2 more biomes with hard checkpoints at biomes 3, 5, and 7, and now we're feasting on a full Thanksgiving spread. The issue with judging this game according to traditional hours of gameplay is that the roguelike element makes that figure widely variable. A highly skilled player may only take 10 hours to beat the game, while a new player may never beat it. And while I understand that the procedurally generated rooms and items give each playthrough a bit of original flavor, when you get down to the brass tacks, each biome only offers about 2 to 3 hours of truly unique experience. Multiplied by the individual biomes, and you're left with around 14 hours. Again, I don't think it's fair to compare this one-to-one with games that do linear storylines, but most linear games target a bare minimum of 40 hours, which is significantly higher than 14. In terms of replay value, I think there is definitely some. You might want to try runs that focus on parasite builds or malfunction-based builds, or try speccing heavily into protection, weapon damage, or melee. The issue with this is that since all the artifacts are randomly generated, you can't really choose what build you'll do up front. You may want to attempt a melee build only to find the first shop has no melee enhancing artifacts. There is also the Tower of Sisyphus, which came from the same patch as the co-op. The tower offers an interesting challenge for those who have completed the main story. Each tower phase has 20 levels and a boss at the end. From what I understand, the tower is endless, meaning players can forever try and top their high score. Levels alternate between those filled with enemies and those with fabricators or other support items. You gain points by killing enemies and can earn multipliers by clearing levels quickly. The same elements such as weapon proficiency, artifacts, stat augments, resin, keys, and items exist in what is essentially a fast-paced, truncated version of the regular game. Having recently tried it, it's pretty fun and certainly adds to the replay value. The multiplayer options for Returnal boil down to co-op, which became available after a post-launch update. And while not available on release, this co-op mode slays. The entire game can be accessed during co-op with enemy number and stat scaling. I would love to see more games offer this. Honestly, this added co-op feature is what prompted me to buy the game, and I had a great time exploring from start to finish with a friend. To summon a co-op participant, simply go to the white bubble called Chronosis at the start of each biome and hit triangle to activate. You can host a private or public cycle to play with a friend or stranger, or join a cycle which will pair you with a random host. When hosting a private cycle, you are immediately taken to your friends list where you can select a player you'd like to invite. The person invited will get an in-game notification, making the process for joining seamless. The other nice thing about co-op is that with the revive function and basic tactics like distracting bigger enemies, the level of difficulty is decreased. This makes the game more accessible to casual players or even new players given they're paired with a veteran. The only real drawbacks to co-op are that it can make the game even quicker, and there was a pretty prevalent bug at the time when I played that would leave your partner glitched out and unable to assist you on the third boss. This was especially frustrating given that it occurred during a great cycle and that I died to the boss I would have beaten had it not been buffed for co-op. For those of you that like playing co-op, Returnal may be a great choice for you. When broken down section by section, there are a few places Returnal doesn't excel. Game flow, check. Combat, check. Leveling, check. Visuals and audio, check. The list goes on and on. The only issues I see are a story that forgot it was written for a video game and not the Cannes Film Festival, and a feeling that the game wasn't quite long enough, particularly for skilled players. Apart from that, the only grievances I can identify would stem from people who didn't know what they were getting into. For example, this game could be a miss for A, casual players not up to the challenging combat system, B, players who prefer traditional progression to roguelike formats, and C, players turned off by the bullet hell style. It's almost like the game needs 2 ratings, one for the uninitiated and one for those in the know. The first might be closer to an 80 and the latter a 90. If the game had delivered a more satisfactory ending and added 2 to 4 more biomes, this game would be approaching perfection. But given the game's unusual approach, certain to exhilarate some while annoying others, I'm going to split the difference and give Returnal an ERG score of 85. Do let me know what you think in the comments below, and feel free to recommend the next game deserving an ERG rating. Last but not least, do please like and subscribe if you found this review enjoyable and would like to support me creating additional content. Thank you all so much, and I hope to see you again soon.